Welcome everyone to the ICRP webinar introducing ICRP publication 152, Radiation Detriment Calculation Methodology. I am Nobuhiko Ban, the chair of Task Group 102, which made this publication 152. Today, we have 3 presentations and each presentation for 30 minutes. And just a brief instruction for the participant. You can post questions using Q&A functions of the Zoom. And first, we will have 3 presentations consecutively. And after the 3 presentations, we will answer the questions. So now let me start with the first presentation from myself. So now, in this first presentation, I'm going to talk about the basics of radiation detriment. Publication 152 is the final report of Task Group 102. Task Group 102 was created under the Committee 1 in 2016. The members of Task Group 102 are shown here. What is the scope and objective of this publication? Simply put, it is part of the review of the system of radiological protection. So the mandate of this task group was to revisit historical development of radiation detriment, scrutinize the calculation methodology, in particular, detailed the calculation procedure in publication 103, and to identify room for improvement. This last part is just a discussion on possible improvement, so it should not be interpreted as a decision to make changes at this moment. These are chapters of publication 152. First, introduction, historical development, calculation of radiation detriment, sensitivity of radiation detriment calculation, potential evolution, and summary and conclusions. Today, I will talk about the first 3 chapters. And in the second presentation, Wei will talk about chapter 4. And finally, Dominic will give a presentation on chapter 5. So let me start with this first part. Chapter 1 of publication summarizes the concept of detriment. The detriment concept was first introduced in publication 22, which was published in 1973. That means detriment concept has a half-century history. Detriment was defined as the expectation of harm in an exposed group. It considers the probability and severity of effects. Initially, harm was intended to encompass deleterious effects of all sorts, including the socioeconomic impact. But only health effects were considered in practice, so now detriment is regarded as an expected value of the weighted number of health effects. Detriment was redefined as multidimensional concept in publication 60. It means we can evaluate detriment using several indexes, such as lifetime risk or years of life lost. But they represent just partial aspects of detriment, and detriment itself is an abstract concept. But still, aggregate detriment as a single index is used, especially for the purpose of determining the values of tissue weighting factors. And this detriment as a single index is specifically called radiation detriment. And we need to aware that there are some caveats. First, detriment does not precisely represent risks for any particular individual. It is defined for population or a group of individuals who are exposed. It is applicable to low dose and or low dose rate exposures. At least it is not intended to be used for acute high dose exposures. And one important point is detriment is not a projection of the absolute number of cases of stochastic effects in the exposed group. So what is it then? It is inferences based on assumptions to assess the potential health impact for radiological protection purposes. Chapter 2 reviews history of detriment calculation. In publication 26, detriment was quantified in the form of risk factor, which is probability of fatal cancer and severe hereditary effects for the first 2 generations. But in this risk factor, non-fatal cancer was not taken into account. Non-fatal component was covered in the subsequent publication 27. In publication 27, years of healthy life lost per 1,000 worker years at risk was assessed. It was called index of harm. This publication aimed to assess the total harm from radiation exposure and other occupational hazards for the purpose of verifying the appropriateness of those equivalent limits for workers. And publication 27 was revised in publication 45, which was published in 1985. In publication 60, radiation detriment was assessed as weighted number of cases of cancer and serious hereditary effects in all future generations. Cancer risk model, mortality-based cancer risk model was used in this assessment. And in publication 103, again, weighted number of cases were assessed for cancer and heritable diseases for the first 2 generations. And cancer risk was assessed using incidence-based cancer risk models. And chapter 3 of the publication 152 detailed the procedure for calculating radiation detriment in publication 103. This picture shows the whole procedure for radiation detriment calculation. The procedure has 2 main parts. nominal risk calculation, and severity adjustment. What I want to emphasize in this picture is there are many steps to calculate radiation detriment, and there are a quite number of inputs for that. Now I'm going to explain how these steps were implemented, mainly focusing on the first part, nominal risk calculation. As a first step of calculation, it is necessary to define populations for which radiation detriment is calculated. To utilize incidence-based cancer risk models, baseline cancer incidence data need to be prepared. So in publication 103, populations with long-running cancer registries were selected. They were Shanghai from China, Osaka, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki from Japan, Sweden, United Kingdom, and US SEER program. Using data from these selected populations, 4 composite reference populations were constructed. They are Asian male, Asian female, Euro-American male, and Euro-American female. For these 4 reference populations, composite baseline rates and demographic data were computed from available statistics. Cancer risk models were prepared for cancer sites shown here. Most of them were based on LSS incidence data from 1958 to 1998. This was published as a paper in 2007. For female breast and thyroid, data from pooled analysis were used. For leukemia, risk model was developed based on LSS incidence data from 1950 to 2000, but this data was not published. Dose risk relationship was linear quadratic for leukemia, but linear for the other cancer sites. Input to the risk model was sex, dose, age at exposure, and attained age. Output from the risk model is excess absolute risk for the EAR model and excess relative risk for the ERR model. In the publication, mathematical formulae of the models are given with parameter values. The essence of nominal risk calculation is computing the lifetime excess risk for given conditions. So non-cancer mortality rates and baseline cancer incidence rates are taken from population data, and excess cancer incidence rates were computed using the cancer risk models. With them, cancer-free survival was computed, and excess risks were accumulated up to the age of 94 years. Lifetime risk metric. There are several lifetime risk metrics such as LAR, ELR, but risk metric used for detriment calculation was REIC, risk of exposure-induced cancer incidence. And also it should be noted that a single exposure to 0.1 gray was assumed in this calculation. This computational process was repeated for every combination of conditions shown here and averaged across populations, risk models, ages at exposure for each cancer site. So there are 11 cancer sites, 4 populations, 2 risk models, and 90 ages at exposure. This slide summarizes the process of averaging across ages. REICs for 0 to 89 years of age were used to calculate nominal risks for the whole population, and 18 to 64 years of age for working age population. Weighted mean of the REICs were computed, and the weight was assigned in proportion to the population of each age group. So in this way, age-averaged lifetime excess risk was calculated. And the next step, transfer of risk estimates. Risk estimates based on the ERR model depend on the baseline incidence, while the EAR estimates do not. Which of them should be given priority is an issue of transfer of risk estimates across populations. To address this issue, ERR estimate and EAR estimate was averaged as a weighted mean. And weight was different depending on the cancer sites. For lung, 30% weight was given to ERR estimate and 70% to EAR estimate. For breast, 100% EAR estimate. For thyroid, 100% ERR estimate. For the other cancer sites, 50% weights were given, so it is just unweighted mean between ERR estimate and EAR estimate. And then, dose and dose rate effectiveness factor. In publication 103, so it is described that the Commission finds no compelling reason to change its 1990 recommendations of a DDREF of 2. This risk reduction factor of 2 is used by the Commission to derive the nominal risk coefficients for all cancers. So lifetime risk estimates were halved, except leukemia, because for leukemia, linear quadratic dose response was assumed. And finally, lifetime risk estimates were averaged between four reference populations. That means Asian males, Asian females, Euro-American males, and Euro-American females. And this gives nominal risk per 0.1 gray. Multiplying by 10 yields nominal risk coefficient per gray. For solid cancers, this value equals to nominal risk directly calculated for one gray. But it is not the case with leukemia because LQ dose response was assumed for leukemia. Nominal risk was separately estimated for some components. They are bone cancer, skin cancer, and heritable effects. There is evidence that bone cancer could be induced by radiation, but the LSS provided no data. So nominal risk estimate in publication 60 was used. For non-melanoma skin cancer, it was judged that the LSS may not demonstrate the risk for general population because of differences in skin pigmentation. And for this reason, nominal risk estimate in publication 59 was used. For heritable effects, the risk for the first two generations was estimated based on UNSCARE 2001 report. Of course, there is no evidence of risk increase in heritable effects in humans. So risk of radiation exposure for heritable effects was assessed based on mouse data. On reviewing, on reviewing the computation process for publication 103, the task group found some ambiguities and errors. So this slide summarizes them. Regarding the risk model, in publication 103, there was no description about leukemia risk model. So in publication 152, we provided mathematical expression of the leukemia risk model. And risk model for breast cancer in publication 103 was not correct, unfortunately. So we corrected in publication 152. For lifetime risk calculation, minimum latency period, ages at exposure, REIC, so integral period, so accumulation period of lifetime risk was not clear in publication 103. We clarified them. Minimum latency period was 5 years for all cancer sites, including leukemia. Ages at exposure were 0 to 89 years for the whole population, and 18 to 64 years for working age population. And accumulation period of risk for lifetime risk calculation was 94 years of age. And for averaging process, age distribution of each reference population was not provided in publication 103, and it was provided in publication 152. And in publication 103, it was described that only EAR model was used for estimating the leukemia risk. That means 100% EAR model for leukemia, but it was not correct. 50% EAR estimates. It was corrected. Another important finding was a miscalculation of the nominal risks for the working age population. This graph compares the nominal risk for working age population in publication 103 and recalculated, corrected nominal risk calculation for this population. The error was that more weight was given to older ages at exposure than intended. Consequently, a marked difference is found in breasts which have a much higher sensitivity at younger ages. And another error was DDREF2 was mistakenly applied to leukemia. So there's a difference of a factor of 2. These errors were found at a later stage of the task group activity after the public consultation was closed. The error was unfortunate, and then the task group discussed with MC members how to deal with the issue. After the discussion, it was concluded that we should openly admit the errors, but they would not affect the current RP system. The reasons are summarized here. First, the impact of the errors on the overall nominal risk is limited, as I show in previous slide. The errors do not affect the values of tissue weighting factor because tissue weighting factors were determined based on the detriment calculation for the whole population, not working age population. And correction of errors does not change the conclusion of publication 103. In publication 103, it is written, the approximated overall fatal risk coefficient of 5% per seatbelt, on which current international radiation safety standards are based, that means publication 60, continues to be appropriate for the purposes of radiological protection. So we judge it. Miscalculations have no implications for operation of the system of radiological protection. So now I'd like to talk about very briefly about the second step, severity adjustment. Radiation detriment is given by this formula in which D represents radiation detriment and R represents nominal risk coefficient. So this hatched part represents adjustment term, which consists of 3 adjustment factors. K, lethality fraction. It is judgment-based value reflecting the impact of medical treatment. Q, quality of life factor. It is adjustment factor for non-fatal cancers that reflects pain, suffering, and any adverse effects of cancer treatment. And L, relative years of cancer-free life lost. It is based on the estimated average ages of onset for cancer sites. QOL factor represents the weight given to non-fatal conditions. So in this formula, in the parentheses, K, term K represents the fatal component, and the term Q multiplied by 1 minus K represents non-fatal component. And relative radiation detriments for the whole population were used in determining the values of tissue weighting factor. And this graph compares the values of relative radiation detriment and tissue weighting factor. As you can see, relative radiation detriments are not directly used. Instead, organs and tissues were grouped in some categories according to the relative radiation detriment. And this is the categorization: lung, breast, stomach, bone marrow, colon, and remainder. They are regarded as organs or tissues of highest radiation detriments, and tissue weighting factor of 0.12 was assigned. For gonads, 0.08 of WT was assigned to represent the risk of heritable effects and ovarian cancer. Bladder, esophagus, liver, and thyroid were regarded as the tissues of intermediate radiation detriments, and 0.04 was assigned. Bone and skin were lowest tissues of lowest radiation detriments, and 0.01 was assigned. Radiation detriment was not assessed for salivary glands and brain, so they are part of other solids, strictly speaking, but if judged, their risk will be greater than any other remainders. So 0.01 of WT was assigned specifically for 2 tissues. And this is the summary of my part. So for chapter 1 to 3 of publication 152. This publication constitutes a part of the review of the system of radiological protection. Historical development of the detriment concept and its scope of application are summarized. Procedure of nominal risk calculation in publication 103 has been clarified. Although programming errors were found in nominal risk calculation for the working age population, the miscalculation has no practical impact on the system of radiological protection. And before concluding my talk, let me introduce papers published in scientific journals. Some work of this task group was published as scientific papers. First one is the summary of chapter 3, procedure for detriment calculation. Second one is related to the sensitivity analysis, which will be explained in the next presentation. And the last one is the summary of the whole publication, publication 152. And that is all from me, and I would like to pass the microphone to Wei for the next presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Wei Zhang from UK HSA, and I will talk about sensitivity analysis of detriment calculation on behalf of task group 102. In Dr. Ben's presentation, he has shown the background information and the methods of detriment calculation. In the following presentation, I will talk about which parameters affect the detriment calculation. That might provide some useful information to be considered for the future ICRP recommendation. The detriment is calculated by this equation. This is defined in the ICRP publication 103. R is the lifetime nominal risk. K is the lethality of the diseases, and Q is the quality of life after the onset of the disease. L is the relative cancer-free life lost. To do the lifetime risk calculation, it requires some demographic data. First of all, we need the age-specific cancer incidence rate without radiation exposure. That is the normal cancer incidence rate at every age. We have both Euro-American population and Asian population data to use. They are listed in the ICRP publication 103. Secondly, we need a cancer incidence rate after radiation exposure. The incidence rate, which is conditional on a given radiation dose D at age at exposure E. We can derive that using ICRP radiation risk models. Last quantity we need is a survival function. That is the probability of surviving to age A when exposed to dose D at age at exposure E. The survival function can be derived based on all-cause mortality data, cancer incidence and cancer mortality, etc., based on Kaplan-Meier method. Once we know the cancer incidence data without and with radiation exposure and corresponding survival functions, we can use this equation for the lifetime risk calculations. We call it the risk of exposure-induced cancer incidence, REIC. It basically is the cancer incidence with radiation exposure minus cancer incidence without radiation exposure, then multiplied by survival function, and then sum them up from the age at exposure E plus L, the latency period, and sum up to the end of life. Although the formula looked quite simple, but many parameters are used in the detriment calculations. The calculation procedure for the ICRP detriments are listed in this slide. For each combination of geographical regions, either Asian or Euro-American population, and 6 male and females, lifetime risk was calculated at a single exposure of 0.1 gray, then multiplied by 10. 5 years of latencies were assumed as latency period for all cancers. For each age at exposure 0 to 89, lifetime risk was accumulated up to a attained age of 94, then averaged over age at exposure. Then the lifetime risk was averaged across models, risk models, with a 100% EAR model for breast cancer, 100% ERR model for thyroid cancer, 30% ERR plus 70% EAR model for lung cancer, and 50% ERR and 50% EAR models for all other cancer sites. Then the risk is averaged over population and sex. The lifetime risk was adjusted downward by a DDIEF value of 2, except for leukemia. Then it's again adjusted for lethality, quality of life, and relative life lost to get the detrimental values. This is how the calculations were performed in the publication 103. The results are simple to use for the purpose of radiation protection. However, some details were smoothed out. The question now is, how much does detriment vary if the calculation parameters change? In this sensitivity analysis, the calculation methodology is the same as that one in the publication 103, but with a different parameter listed as shown in these slides. We will average the detriment over 0 to 14 years and 18 to 64 years, and also 0 to 89 years. As we know that ICRP publication only did the detriment averaged over 0 to 89, but we were in the sensitivity analysis, we will cover 0 to 14 and 18 to 64 years. We will calculate detriment for the male and the female separately, and for the Euro-American population and the Asian population separately. We will also test the 100% ERR model and the 100% EAR model separately. We were using different attend age for 94 years or 99 years attend age during the calculation. We were also trying the different latency period. Instead of 5 years for latency period for solid cancer, we'll also test for 10 years for solid cancers. And also we will test 2 or 5 years for leukemia. We will use a different DDIF values. And we also will test a different lifetime risk calculation methods. Instead of just using REIC, we will also do a test for life attributed risk calculations. We will also do the calculations for different exposure levels. We know that ICRP publication 103 calculates the lifetime risk at 0.1 grade and multiply by 10 to get that value per civet. We will calculate the lifetime risk at 1 grade directly and make comparisons with what presented in ICRP publication 103. We're also using different lethality values and different minimum quality of life values and different relative cancer-free life lost. The alternative value or condition was applied one at a time to examine the impact of each parameter on the radiation detriment. It was not a comprehensive uncertainty assessment, but it would be illustrative of a potential impact of the various factors involved in the calculation of radiation detriment. This graph shows the effect of age at exposure group. It compares the detriment between 3 groups of age at exposure, 0 to 14 years, 18 to 64 years, and 0 to 89 years, which represent young age group, working population, and the whole population respectively. Compared to the standard detriment averaged over 0 to 89 years, the detriment for the working age population shows lower value for most of cancers, but high value for lung cancer, indicated in the red elliptical circles. For most cancer type, the detriment for the young age at exposure population 0 to 14 years is higher than that for the whole population 0 to 89 years, shown in blue elliptical circles. In some cases, breast cancer, thyroid cancer, and other solid cancer, indicated by the last 3 blue elliptical circles, the detriments for age at exposure 0 to 14 years is about 2 to 3 times higher compared with that of 0 to 89 years. In ICRP publication 123, the standard detriment were averaged over sexes. This methodology applied to all cancer types, despite the fact that some cancers are sex-specific, such as ovarian cancer and breast cancer. This graph shows the detriment separately for male and females, and averaged over sexes. For stomach cancer, lung cancer, and thyroid cancer, shown in red elliptic circles, detriment for females appear to be higher than that for males, whereas the opposite is observed for colon, liver, and other solid cancers, shown in blue circles. For breast cancer and ovarian cancer, shown in green circles, the standard detriment reduced by a factor of 2 if averaged with a male detriment compared to that calculated for females only. The detriment were averaged over two composite populations in ICRP publication 103. These slides show the detriment for Euro-American and Asian populations separately, along with the averaged value. For stomach, colon, liver, breast cancer, indicated by blue elliptic circles, detriment for Asian population appeared to be higher than that of a Euro-American population. For other solid cancers indicated in red, the detriment for Euro-American population was somewhat higher than that for the Asian population. Compared to the standard detriment, the maximum relative difference was always below 30%. In ICRP publication 1.3, the standard detriment were derived from a combination of ERR and EAR models. This graph shows the detriment calculated with the 100% ERR-based model and the 100% EAR-based model separately for each cancer type in comparison with the standard detriment. The contribution from an ERR-based model is relatively small. For stomach cancer and liver cancer, shown in blue circles, they are less than 2/3 of the standard detriment, but relatively large for colon, lung, bladder, other solid cancers, and leukemia, shown in red circles, up to 25% higher than in the standard detriment. The detriment calculation in ICRP publication 1.3 consider cumulative risk up to the age of 94 years. We extended the attained age to 99 years instead of 94 years to examine the dependence of detriment on attained age. This slide shows a comparison of cancer detriment for the two different attained age. The detriment with the attained age of 99 years increased only slightly, almost unnoticeable in the graph. A minimum latency of 5 years for all types of cancer was considered in the publication 103. This graph compares detriment calculated using a latency period of 5 or 10 years for solid cancer, but 5 or 2 years for leukemia. There was a little difference in detriment for solid cancer when calculated with a latency 10 years instead of 5 years, but a noticeable increase for leukemia when calculated with a latency of 2 years instead of 5 years, shown in a blue circle. In publication 103, the standard detriment was divided by a factor of 2 to make an adjustment for exposure at low dose and low dose rates. This graph compares the standard detriment and the detriment calculated with a DDIF of 1. As expected, the detriment increased by a factor of 2. If DDIF equal to 1 is used for the calculation. Detriment is inversely proportional to the DDIF value. However, there's no change for leukemia as DDIF is not applied to leukemia. It has been taken care of by the linear quadratic risk model for leukemia. These slides summarize what I have seen in the sensitivity analysis so far. The detriment increased by a factor of 2 with a DDIF of 1. For breast and ovarian cancers, detriment increased by 2 if calculated for female only. For lung cancer, stomach cancer, and thyroid cancer, detriment for female appeared to be higher than that for male, but the inverse is observed for liver cancer, colon cancer, other solid cancers, and leukemia. For most cancer types, the detriment for the young age at exposure population, 0 to 14 years, is higher than that of a whole population 0 to 89 years. For breast cancer, thyroid cancer, and other solid cancer, the detriment for age at exposure 0 to 14 years is about 2 to 3 times higher compared with that of 0 to 89 years. The lifetime risk was calculated using IEIC, as I mentioned earlier, but it can also be calculated using a method called lifetime attributed risk, LAR. This method is slightly simpler and is a good approximation to IEIC if the calculation is done at low doses. People often use LAR for similar calculations, as one can see that the difference in these two formulas is the survival function. The survival function for IEIC takes into account of radiation exposure of D at age E, but the survival function for LAR does not take into account of radiation exposure. This is how the two survival function compares to each other if the radiation exposure is 0.1 gray for age at exposure of 1 year old. The difference is indeed very small. This graph compares radiation detriment calculated with these two lifetime risk metrics, showing that the use of LAR instead of IEIC, giving us similar results when both of them were calculated at 0.1 gray. This is because of single exposure of 0.1 gray does not cause a significant change to the survival curve, as shown in the previous slide. However, now come back to IEIC. If the IEIC are calculated at a different dose level, then normalized to that at 1 gray, the results would be different. This graph shows IEIC calculated at 0.1 gray and multiplied by 10, comparing with IEIC calculated at 1 gray directly. The detriment based on IEIC at 1 gray is significantly lower than 10 times IEIC at 0.1 gray for solid cancers, with a difference of up to 21%, shown in blue circles. For leukemia, detriment based on IEIC at 1 gray is approximately 2.5 times higher than the 10 times IEIC at 0.1 gray, shown in red circles. This is due to the effect of the quadratic term in the dose response model for leukemia, which is negligible if it was calculated at 0.1 gray. As mentioned earlier, the radiation detriment is also dependent on lethality, quality of life, and the relative life lost. This graph shows a comparison between the standard detriment calculated using lethality fractions described in publication 103, and that with a lethality fraction equal to 1, which would be the worst case scenario. For colon cancer, breast cancer, bladder cancer, thyroid cancer, and other solid cancer showing blue circles, it is noticeable that there is a reduction in detriment using a lethality fraction less than 1. The reduction is up to a factor of 3 for thyroid cancer. So it is important to reduce the lethality of cancer, hopefully by improving medical treatment. This graph shows the effect of a minimum quality of life. The minimum quality of life accounts for the minimum suffering associated with a non-fatal cancer. ICRP defined the minimum quality of life as 0.2 for thyroid cancer and 0.1 for other types of cancer in publication 103. This graph shows a comparison between the standard detriment and that calculated with a minimum quality of life equal to 0. The impact is very small for all cancer types, except for thyroid cancer, for which detriment is reduced by more than a factor of 2, as shown in blue circles. These slides show the comparison between the standard detriment in publication 103 and that calculated using a relative cancer-free life lost equal to 1. Variation in detriment are observed, especially for stomach cancer, lung cancer, blood cancer, indicated in blue circles, and also breast cancer and leukemia in red circles, although the direction of change depends on the type of cancer, with a maximum impact reaching about 25%. So it is clear that there's a very little difference between IEIC and LAAR method for lifetime radiation calculation method if it is calculated at dose at low doses, something like 0.1 grays, and linearly extrapolate to risk at 1 grays. In comparison to above-mentioned method, IEIC calculated at 1 gray decreases for solid cancers, but increases for leukemia by a factor greater than 2 due to the effect of a linear quadratic dose response. For colon cancer, breast cancer, blood cancer, and other solid cancers, detriment increases as lethality K increases. For lung and stomach cancers, the detriment increases if the relative life lost increases. So in this sensitivity analysis, we calculate the ratio of the altered detriment to the ICRP standard detriment. So we can classify the severity of impact according to the following criteria. For a minimum impact, we give a star, one star. That means a factor of change less than 1.5. For moderate impact, we give 2 stars, means a factor of change greater than 1.5 but less than 2. Then third category is a substantial impact. We gave a 3 star, means a factor change greater equal to 2. Based on our severity definition, we can see that the parameters have the most impact on detriment are sex, age at exposure, exposure dose. That means that whether it is calculated at 0.1 gray and multiplied by 10 versus calculating at 1 gray directly. The fact have most impact also including DDIF and the lethality fractions. These parameters can cause variation in detriment by a factor greater than 2. So to summarize the sensitivity analysis, we see that there's only slight variation of detriment due to latency, attained age, lifetime risk calculation method when it is calculated at low dose, or minimum quality of life. There's a noticeable variation of detriment with the population, with the transfer models, either 100% ER or 100% EAR, or combined them together. And also there's a noticeable variation with a relative life lost. 6 has a major impact for certain cancer types. Need to think about whether lifetime risk for breast cancer and ovarian cancer should be averaged with over 6. The age at exposure has a major impact on detriment, with a much smaller detriment for 0 to 89 years group than 0 to 14 years group for some cancer types. And also the DDIF and the lethality also has a major impact on cancer detriment. Okay, that's all I can talk. Thank you very much. Now
Thank you very much, Wei, for this very clear presentation. With no transition, I propose we move now to the third and last presentation of today. So I have to share my screen. So that's the last presentation that will go on. After that, we are going to have 30 minutes for questions and answers. But already now you can ask questions in the chat, in the Q&A list. So don't hesitate to propose questions already. So, I'm Dominique Laurier. I was a member of Task Group 102, and I'm also the chair of Committee 1, which is dealing with biological effects and health effects of radiation exposure. This third presentation will continue on the two first presentations. So Nobui Koban presented the historical development and the calculation of the radiation detriment as it has been done in publication 103. And Wei Zhang presented section 4 on the sensitivity to illustrate what is the impact of the different elements that are used in the calculation of the detriments. And I'm going to discuss, to present you, to speak about the potential evolution that are recommended in publication 152. So what's next after publication 152 for radiation detriment? So 6 different routes of potential evolutions have been identified in the work of publication 152. The first one is to incorporate recent scientific findings, so to update the input data that are provided for the calculation of the detriment. The second one is to update the baseline statistics and demographic data that are used for the calculation of the detriment. The third one is refinement of the adjustment parameters that are used to weight for the severity of cancer. The fourth one is handling of variations. In the presentation by Wei Zhang, it has been clear that several factors show large variation of the risk for specific cancer sites, especially age and sex. And the two last ones are to ensure transparency and to improve communication in the calculation and in the use of radiation detriment. So to begin with the first one, the first one is to incorporate recent scientific findings. The first step is really to look at cancer risk models. As has been presented before, the detriment is based on the use of several risk models for different organs, for 11 organs. We use cancer risk models that have been derived from the A-bomb survivors cohort on the basis of a follow-up to 1998. And the nominal risk for bone cancer and skin cancer have been taken from publication 60 and 59. And so the data that have been used, the knowledge that have been used for the estimation of this nominal risk is from 1991 and 1992, so more than 30 years ago for these two cancer sites. No specific risk models were available, were used for brain and salivary glands, and the risk models were all derived essentially from the LSS, from the A-bomb survivors cohort, which is a very specific situation of exposure, of course. And so the first proposal for evolution is clearly to update what we know about the cancer risk models. It's clearly feasible to use more recent model, more updated models today. A lot of publications have been made from the A-bomb survivors cohort, but also from many other epidemiological studies in the world, to complete the list of radiation-induced cancers for brain and possibly for prostate today, and to consider model derived from other epidemiological studies outside of the A-bomb survivors. Of course, to consider the A-bomb survivors, but to consider these different studies in complement to the LSS. Still, in the idea to update input data for the calculation of the detriment, the second parameter that has been presented by Nobuhiko just before is the dose and dose rate effectiveness factor. And in the presentation by Wei Zhang, it has been shown that this parameter has a high importance. That detriment is highly sensitive to this parameter. The application of a dead wave of 2 to reduce the nominal risk coefficient compared to what is directly calculated using models derived from the A-bomb survivors. The application of a factor of 2, when we apply these risk models to low dose and dose rate, has been introduced in the system in the calculation of detriment in publication 60, so in 1991. And it has not been revised since that. Of course, since that, a large amount of new results from both experimental studies, in vitro and in vivo experimental studies, but also from epidemiological studies, have accumulated during the last decades. And it's possible today to analyze from all this material, it's possible today to analyze much better separately the effects of low doses and the effect of dose rates. With both of these effects are included in the dead wave coefficient. So the recommendation is to conduct a detailed and complete review of current knowledge and to have a reflection on what's the relevance of applying a dead wave today. What are the possible values after this review of the current knowledge for this parameter for this factor. Dead wave, what are the potential alternative approaches? And finally, what is the potential impact of these different choices on the calculation of the detriment? A third input in the calculation of the detriment is about heritable effects. So effects that are observed in the offspring in the next generation of people that have been exposed to radiation. In complement to cancer. The risk of heritable effects is based on results from animal experiments assessed by the UNSCEAR in its report in 2001, so more than 20 years ago again. What it considers genetic risk, congenital abnormalities, multifactorial chronic diseases expressed to the second generation after exposure. And the approach that has been used in publication 103 to introduce heritable effects in the detriment calculation is not straightforward, to say the least. And of course, in the recent years, also on this topic, new findings have been obtained, and a large amount of literature is available today, including epigenetic inheritance, that have been shown of importance for transgenerational, multi-generational transmission of effects outside of the radiation field. And that was not considered. Epigenetic mechanisms were not known or little considered in 2000. And so for heritable effects also, clearly there is a need for an update, review of the scientific literature on the radiation and heritable effects, hereditary effects, and also to clarify the approach used to introduce heritable effects in the calculation of the radiation detriment. The last point, I think, concerning scientific findings, knowledge about radiation-induced effects is about non-cancer effects. A complete review of deterministic effects of tissue reactions have been performed in 2012 by the ICRP and published in publication 118. And at that time, the Commission proposed to classify circulatory diseases and cataracts as tissue reactions with a threshold of 0.5 gray, which means that below this threshold, we consider that there is no risk, and that above this threshold, the severity of the effect is increasing with increasing dose. But in the recent years, evidence has accumulated that some long-term non-cancer diseases may be induced at much lower doses than previously considered, especially below this threshold of 0.5 gray for circulatory disease, especially. And the expression of this increase in risk is not on the severity, but on the frequency of the diseases, which is the expression, the classical expression of what we call stochastic effects. And the detriment is thought to reflect the whole potential effects of stochastic effects after radiation exposure. Nevertheless, if these effects were to be included in the detriment calculation, a detailed calculation of the lifetime risk appears highly challenging at the time being. So for non-cancer effects, clearly also there is a need to update the review of the scientific literature, so since 2012, on radiation and non-cancer diseases, especially for long-term non-cancer diseases, to consider revising the classification of radiation-induced disease to make sure that the classification is fit for purpose, including this long-term non-cancer diseases, and to assess the relevance and feasibility of including circulatory disease or cataract as a stochastic effects, and estimate the potential impact of this decision on the calculation of the detriment. So that's the different points that we can extract from the work of TG 102 and publication 152 for what do we know about radiation-induced effects. But we saw from the presentation of Nobuhiko just before that not only radiation knowledge of radiation effects is needed for the calculation of the detriment, but also input data that are outside of the radiation field. The first source is the reference population. Baseline statistics and demographic data are calculated at the time being in publication 103 based on two reference population. Asian, based on the data from two countries, China and Japan, and Euro-American with data coming from three different countries, Sweden, UK, and the US. And these reference populations are the source for demographic data, mortality rate, and cancer baseline rates. But the reference data that are used in publication 103, of course, are the ones that were available at the time. And they correspond to the period 1993 to 1997, so more than 25 years ago. And we know that the baseline rates, for at least for some specific cancer sites, have shown very important evolutions in the recent decades. So for this source also, there is a need for updated data. And also it is clearly possible today to have a much better representation of the world population instead of using reference data coming from only 5 different countries. The last point for improvement, for update, is to refine the adjustment for severity. The different parameters that are used for severity also are not coming from the radiation field. That's indicators that are outside of the radiation field. At the time being, there are 3 different parameters that are used to weight the calculation of the lifetime cancer risk, the nominal coefficients, the lethality fraction, an estimate of the years of life lost after cancer, and the adjustment for quality of life after cancer. 2 of these parameters are mainly expert judgment, based on expert judgment, and for lethality fraction, and it has been shown in the presentation by Wei Zhang that this lethality fraction can have a very important effect on the calculation of the detriment. These lethality fractions are calculated from one source of information from the US, and the most recent data were 1980 to 1985. close to 40 years ago. And this lethality fraction reflects the ratio between the incidence of cancer, so the occurrence of cancer in a population, and the mortality by cancer. And the factor that plays a role in this lethality ratio is, of course, the quality of treatment. And we know that the treatment for some of the cancer sites have shown a very important improvements in the last decades, which is not considered in the detriment as it is calculated right now. So for these severity parameters, we consider that there is also a need for update of the different parameters, also a need to improve the transparency in the determination of these parameters, especially citing the data sources, to take into account variation between sex and regions, which is not the case at the time being, and to consider also elaborated approaches, such as the disability adjusted life years, the DALI, to estimate and characterize the severity of cancers. Again, this part on the severity of cancer is not coming from the radiation field. It's not coming from our knowledge of the effects of radiation. It is based on the reflection of the consequences, the health consequences of cancer. And several indicators have been developed outside of the radiation field, like the DALI, for example, that are very useful and used widely to quantify and to reflect the consequences of cancer. And so one question is, do we have to do it on our side to have a specific scheme of calculation for the radiation detriment, or shouldn't we use a kind of indicator which is used widely? It would really help to compare the results of the detriment for radiation with other risk factors for cancer. So that's the different routes of improvement on updating the input data for the calculation of detriment. In addition to that, one strong request to consider the variation of risk between individuals. We know that age at exposure has a large impact on radiation detriment. Especially, we know that for the same dose, an exposure during childhood brings much higher lifetime risk for most cancer sites compared to the same dose, to the same exposure during adulthood. We have shown, it has been shown in the presentation by Wei Zhang, that there are differences with sex, notable for some tissues especially. The detriment values are averaged in the detriment calculation over risk models, over region, over sex and age. And the relative contribution of each cancer site to the global detriment, we know that there are some variation of this relative contribution with sex and age, but these variations are not considered in the system as it is right now, because only one set of WT values is provided in support to the radiation detriment for the radiation protection system. So one route of evolution in the calculation of the detriment, again, is to calculate detriment separately for men and women and for selected age categories. Also to derive new sets of WT for different categories of sex and age. And the idea is not to provide a lot of different indicators of detriment, but to average all these different indicators showing, illustrating the variation of risk with age and sex, and averaging only at the last stage of the calculation in order to provide a simple indicator for radiological protection management purposes. The two last ones are about transparency and improving communication. First, transparency, the calculation of radiation detriment, as you understood from the previous presentation, consists of many steps in which a wide range of information is processed, including risk models, health statistics, along with various other parameters. The separation between what is science-based, between science-based results and expert judgment at the different steps of the detriment calculation is not always explicit. And finally, the makeup of radiation detriment is difficult to understand, even for radiation protection specialists. In addition, the work of TG 102 has illustrated the difficulty to reconstruct retrospectively the different steps to make sure that we are doing exactly what has been done to process it retrospectively for the different steps in the calculation of the detriment. And it also identified errors in the calculation process. So one potential route of improvement for the future is clearly to clarify the source information and to document precisely the detriment calculation procedures to ensure transparency and traceability of the calculation. One way to do that is to apply strict quality control in the calculation in the process of detriment calculation. And one possibility maybe is to develop and share an open source code for the calculation of detriment in the next recommendations. Last point is improving communication. It has been said already. The first point is that uncertainties related to input information, but also to lack of knowledge and the potential impact of underlying assumptions are poorly taken into account in the process as it is right now. The detriment calculation is oriented toward the assessment of the overall impact of radiation on health for stochastic effects. But however, the values obtained are not so easy to understand. And the last point is that the detriment is a specific risk indicator. That's a specific indicator that is used only in the field of ionizing radiation. And so because of that, it is difficult to compare its values with other commonly used health risk indicators outside of the radiation field, for example, for chemicals. So one route of improvement for the future is also to identify the main sources of uncertainties and to characterize their potential impact on the detriment calculation, and also to try to find ways to better explain the quantification of radiation-induced risk and to facilitate the interpretation of the detriment indicator in the future. And we have some ideas to improve this communication. So to conclude with this presentation on the perspectives, I would like to remain that the concept of radiation detriment is not something which is fixed, something that we know for sure forever. It has been introduced in publication 26 in 1977, so more than 40 years now, 45 years. And it has been updated several times since then to keep it as science-based as possible. And today we see that several updates are needed if we want to keep the detriment science-based. Also, the evolution in the calculation of the detriment should allow to better reflect variation of risk between sexes and age categories, even if we keep only one single indicator finally for the application of radiation protection. A careful consideration of the feasibility and pertinence of including specific non-cancer disease, especially long-term non-cancer diseases, in the calculation of the detriment has to be initiated. That's clearly a question that we have to face today. Improvement must be made to ensure the accuracy and transparency of the detriment calculation process. And an effort is needed and is feasible to facilitate the interpretation of the radiation detriment. So to end with this presentation, I would like to say that's a slide I took from a previous presentation by Nobuhiko. Radiation detriment should be based on sound science. It should exercise prudence when uncertainty remains. It should not be overly complex, and it should be comprehensible. And to summarize, the makeup of radiation detriment reflects our wisdom as well as scientific knowledge and understanding. To finish, I would like to say that this reflection on the evolution of the calculation of the detriment is not an isolated process, and it gets into a much larger process of revision and refinement of the recommendation, the ICRP recommendations that have been launched by the ICRP 1 year ago now. With the publication of this paper, keeping the ICRP recommendations fit for purpose. As you know, the last recommendations have been published in 2007. Review and refinement is needed. It has been presented here for the detriment, but for many other parts of the radiological protection system. We have to identify and recognize gaps, to consider needed updates, and from that to identify building blocks that is corresponding to the essential work which is required for the next general recommendations. So for the detriment, the work of TG 102 and published in publication 152 several months ago, has been to revise and to dig and to look precisely in detail at all the different steps in the calculation of the detriment, all the different elements. And from that, several task groups have been initiated already in Committee 1, in ICRP Committee 1. Some of them are existing since several years now, like TG 91, dealing with the dose and dose rate effectiveness factor, TG 111, dealing with variation between individual responses to radiation exposure, and some others are more recent, less than 1 or 2 years, like on circulatory diseases, on the risk for the next generations, so heritable effects. TG 122, which has a huge work to do on the update of cancer detriment, and TG 123, which is intended to reflect on the classification of effects in the current system as it is right now. And so from all these different task groups, from these different building blocks, so the work to identify the building blocks that are needed to update the detriment calculation has been done. These task groups working are in progress, so to develop these building blocks, and from that it will contribute to the development and the consideration about the preparation of the next general recommendations, and the process is intended to be for about 1 decade from now. So the next rendezvous, if you are interested in this process of evolution of the next recommendation of the general recommendations, will be in 1 year from now. It will be at the occasion of the 7th International Symposium on the System of Radiological Protection. It will be held in Tokyo. And so you are all welcome to participate to this to the discussion about this evolution process. With this, I would like to finish my presentation. I would like to thank you for attention, and also I would like to thank all the participants, all the members of TG 102, which who all participated to the elaboration of this work. Thank you for your attention. And with this, I think we can begin the discussion section. So with questions to the three.
Dominic, before answering questions, let me make one correction. In my presentation, I said that the nominal risk per 0.1 gray multiplied by 10 equals to the nominal risk for directly calculated for 1 gray for solid cancers, but it's not correct. It's the case with the LAR, because REIC is used for nominal risk calculation. Nominal risk per 0.1 gray multiplied by 10 is larger than nominal risk directly calculated for 1 gray. That result was shown in the presentation by Wei. So sorry about it.
Thank you, Noriko, for this precision. Before coming to the questions on the content, there were several participants, attendees who asked questions about availability of the slides. So yes, the slides and the recording of the webinar will be available after the webinar shortly at the beginning of 2023. So coming to the questions, I think we can begin with the questions that are in the Q&A. So let's begin with very precise ones, like, for example, the question from Felix Einzel. What kind of lifetime excess risk is used in detriment calculation? Is it LAR or is it REIC? Maybe that's a question for you, Wei.
All right, yeah. The ICRP publication 103, they actually calculate the risk using REIC. But in the text, it was said it used lifetime attributed risk. As I show in my presentation, because all the calculation was being done at 0.1 gray. And in fact, the IEIC and LAR calculated at 0.1 gray produce result more or less same. So although it is calculated using REIC in the publication 103, it's not wrong to say it is a lifetime attributed risk, because when you calculate at 0.1 gray, basically two methods produce almost the same results. So it is all right.
Thank you, Wei. A second question in the Q&A is about the selection of values for the weighting between excess relative risk and excess absolute risk for different organs. Nobuhiko, would you like to provide answers on that?
Actually, without solid evidence, 50% were chosen, in my understanding. But in the case of breast, ER model demonstrates good fit, and in the case of thyroid, ERR. So in those cases, 100% ER model and ER model was used. And for lung cancer, I'm not sure, but not 50-50, but not 100. So 30% ERR and 70% ER was used.
Yeah, if I may, we have to admit that the explanation of different choices compared to 50% in publication 103 is not so clear. For lung cancer, as far as I remember, it's an explanation that it fits better the data in the A-bomb survivors. For the other ones, it's not so simple. In fact, this weighting is sought to weight between two possibilities of transfer between different populations, and I really think it should be possible to improve this weighting in the next years, thanks to many different results that are coming from different populations in the world, and so with a better possibility to compare the results obtained using an excess relative risk and an excess absolute risk in different parts of the world. So in the future, there should be some opportunity to propose better science-based weighting for these parameters.
Yeah, there's also a reason because of the baseline rates for different cancer is different from different populations. So when you're trying to transfer the lifetime risk between the populations, one particular model is not necessarily the best way to do it, and the weighted average works better.
Thank you. So there is a lot of question in the Q&A, so we have to Another question was about the risk coefficient of 5% for CVET, which is considered as the overall fatal risk coefficient in publication 103. However, the detriment is calculating considering fatal and not fatal components, including quality of life. This is confusing. Could you please explain? Maybe. Do you want to answer that point?
Yeah, actually, I admit it is confusing. Sometimes we discuss fatal risks only, but detriment includes non-fatal component that is weighted to be equivalent to fatal. So we need to clarify. So what kind of metric we are using?
Mm-hmm. In fact, the 5% for CVET reflecting the fatal risk coefficient for cancer, it was in publication 60, so in 1991. It's no more the case in publication 103. So to consider that 5% is still the reflection of fatal cancer risk is no more valid since 2007. But I fully agree that the detriment in the end is calculated on the incidence of cancer, lifetime risk of incidence of cancer, weighted by some factors for the severity of cancer, and it's a dimension which is not so easy to understand and interpret in the end. Yes. Another question, maybe for you, Wei, what is the motivation for the formula of the calculation of the detriment from the different three factors of severity? Would you like to answer about that?
Yeah, because of well, it's also related to the last question, because in the epidemiology study, you can study the risk for fatality, and also you can study the risk for incidence. And of course, the incidence data normally provide more accurate information, which nowadays most of epidemiology studies are rely on incidence data. But of course, when you're trying to when you get to the risk of incidence for particular cancer, then you could adjust taking account of lethality to convert them into fatalities. But when we consider incidence, we have to also adjust for quality of life and relative life lost, because for some cancer cases, if the person died at a very young age, the loss of the useful life is quite high compared to a person die at a very old age. So all of these need to be taken into consideration. It's not just we sort of calculate a risk for getting a cancer. We also need to take into different factors into the picture and sort of balance it out. So give a more accurate feels of what the risk is actually doing to people. So that's why this detriment we're sort of calculating. We're not just calculating the nominal risk, we're also taking into consideration of different factors which also affect the person's life. So I think that is a motivation for this the calculations.
Thank you. Another question by James Weston. As we know, have more computing power, is there too much emphasis on the idea of risk based on effective dose, etc.? And we should be looking much more at specific risk related to organ exposure. Would you like to develop that? Or maybe I can try. Of course, that's what is done in the calculation of the detriment. The detriment is is thought to include all the different risks, but for each of the cancer sites, the lifetime calculation of risk, the REIC, is calculated based on the organ exposure. And so all these different calculation, intermediate calculation in the calculation of the detriment are available and can be presented. But the idea of the detriment is to bring all these different risks for different cancer sites, and including also heritable effects, in only one single indicator in the end, not to hide the variation of risk between cancer sites and the risk and sex and age, but to allow a very simple application of the radiation protection system, and that's the aim of the detriment. I hope it answers the question. Maybe in Nobuhiko way you want to extend on that?
Yes, based on that idea, the concept of effective dose was developed, and using effective dose, we can handle various different exposure patterns, including partial exposure, whole body exposure, and external exposure, internal exposure, using the same index, I mean effective dose. Yeah.
Another question from CU Kwangli. Could the recalculation radiation detriments of different organs bring about any change on the tissue weighting factors? So what will be the impact of the new calculation on the weighting, tissue weighting factors?
Theoretically, yes. Yeah, but it depends on the result. But as I explained, tissue weighting factors is not a direct reflection of relative radiation detriment. It was determined based on the relative radiation detriment.
I skipped some questions, but we will come back to that later on. A question by Mark Shavers. Excellent and much appreciated description of sensitivity analysis. Thank you. It is of interest to note differences between the REID-based NASA cancer risk and detriment. While the quantities are mostly minor, NASA NSCR 2012 considers age 35 plus only and omits heritable effects to obtain tissue weights and an uncertain distribution of DDF centered on 1.5 rather than 2. These presentations helps to clarify how the high tissue weight organs like lung, stomach, liver, etc. have a much higher weight than the 0.12 derived from sex average tissue weights of ICRP. Would you like to comment on this different comments on the comparison of what is used by NASA and what is used by the ICRP? Nobuhiko, maybe?
Yeah,
well,
actually, just briefly, NASA is using REID instead of REIC, so it is mortality-based risk assessment, and they also use different variable for DDREF. So this is a sort of uncertainty we should take into account to evaluate, to develop the methodology for detriment calculation in the next stage.
And to extend on this, we have to say that there is a task group of Committee 1, of the ICRP Committee 1, which is ongoing on the radiation protection for astronauts, TG115. And from this task group, it appears that it's very interesting to compare what are the different choices and different hypotheses that are used for different situations of exposure. So protection of the general public for the detriment, for the ICRP, and protection of the astronauts, which is a very specific population for the protection of astronauts for the NASA risk models that are used. And from that, I think there are very interesting comparison and ideas that can be derived. Also, it shows that some of the choices that are in the calculation of the detriment are just some hypotheses, and that other hypotheses can be done for other different for different populations.
Yeah, actually, I am a member of that task group, and the choice of the risk metric is one of the important issues.
Thank you. So next question is from Radia Bungar. It will be interesting to include African population also. I think it was about the consideration of the baseline rates, and yes, clearly that's feasible today, and that's at least that's one of the potential evolutions in the calculation of the detriment, potential improvements. Another question from Franz Wiersma, sorry for the pronunciation. Why is a linear quadratic model assumed for leukemia, and is it still accurate? Would you like to extend on that? The explanation of the choice of the linear quadratic model for leukemia is that at the time of publication 103, it was clear from the results from the A-bomb survivors cohort that the relationship between dose and risk for leukemia was not showing a linear relationship, but much more corresponding to a linear quadratic model, which show a higher curvature at high doses. That's the reason why the choice of a linear quadratic model was made for leukemia, and for the other cancer sites, the evidence for curvature was much less, and that's the reason why linear models have been used for solid cancers up to now. That's one point that has been considered in the review of the literature on the risk, cancer risk associated to radiation now, because there are new results that have to be considered for the evolution of the choice of the risk model that will be used in the evolution of the detriment calculation. Wei and Nobuko, you wanted to add something about that?
Yeah, I mean, the linear quadratic model is based on lifespan study of Japanese atomic bomb survivor studies, and it is basically evidence-based, and the data is a best fit with a linear quadratic models with the data, so that is still valid.
Yeah, I agree.
Another question by Thierry Schneider. Thanks a lot for the clear presentations. I have a question on the reference population and the potential evolution. What is the robustness of the data on incidence in the current reference population, and what about the available data now? If you include a large number of different populations with significant different life expectancy, what could be the impact on the calculation of detriment, and what will be the degree of conservatism in that case?
Yeah, I think it's an important point. Actually, currently, the detriment calculation is based on old data, and if we use the newer data on each population, probably we will get a different result. So, but theoretically, we should rely on up-to-date data. But another point is, as you mentioned, if we try to incorporate as many as data, so as many population as possible, maybe variation could be large. So it is an issue of how to handle the variation, as Dominique discussed. Dominique, anything you want to add?
Well, I think we can move to the next question by Florent de Mater, which is on the same topic. Given the variation between countries in cancer incidence, but also in variation of this incidence, Sorry, it's moving all the time. Maybe to improve the detriment at the world level is a too much complex challenge. You're right. Clearly, that's a challenge, but we have to balance what is the potential impact between extended to the world population or keeping a reference population which is based only on 5 different countries in the world. So we have to find what is the best evolution. And clearly, no, it's not a too complex challenge because data are available today, especially from ICRP. There is no very good estimates with different considering different population in the world, 6 population in the world that are proposed by ICRP and proposed not only for radiation, for the estimation of radiation detriment, but that are proposed to show what is the difference, the variation of incidence of cancer in the different parts of the world. And these data can be used clearly as a basis for an evolution of the detriment if we want to go toward a better reflection of the world population. That's a choice which is under discussion at UNSCARE. There is a task group on cancer risk at UNSCARE, and we are in close contact with this expert group also for several questions of that kind that are shared between UNSCARE and ICRP. Another question, which is very technical on the calculation of the detriment. Can you explain the calculation of the values for the relative years of cancer-free life lost in more detail? From Felix Heinzer. Some more
yes,
words of explanation?
Yes, it is a good question. Actually, in task group 1 or 2, we tried to reproduce this adjustment factor, but it was not successful. So to be honest, how this adjustment factor was calculated in publication 103 remains unsolved.
Another point by Ton van Dillen. Indeed, radiation detriment is an intricate concept, and some of the suggested potential evolution may even make the concept more complicated. So it is of paramount importance not to make the future concept even more complicated. That's clearly one central issue for the evolution of the detriment. Would you like to comment on that, Nobuhiko, maybe?
Yeah, so Dominic, you made a good summary, and actually simple will be better, but actually we need to take into account many aspects of detriment. So how to strike a balance between them?
Yeah, I fully agree with that. We have to consider the evolution of science, and the evolution of science clearly makes it more complicated than it was in the 90s or in 2007. On the other side, we have to keep the system very simple. But I think it is feasible to consider the variation of risk between different populations, between different cancer sites, and to take into account the information that we have today, coming from different sources of epidemiology, of biology, and in the end, to have a system that remains very simple in its application for radiation protection. One way to do that is to clearly separate what is science-based for the calculation of the process, and what is expert judgment. At what place in the calculation of the detriment do we move from what we know about science to expert judgment, to have finally an average indicator which is simple and unique for the application of the radiation protection system. So that's the good balance. But as a member of the new task group 1 to 2, then you're going to have a chance to discuss and go further on that point. We are close to the end, so I'm afraid we are not going to be able to answer all of the questions. I skipped some of the questions that were not directly on the detriment, but that were rather more largely on the calculation of risk and the system by itself. I think we still have time to take a few questions, and for the other ones, I think we will try to provide answers after the webinar. Another question by Jack Valentine. Rather than trying to tweak detriment, might it be better to try to express consistently all radiation arms in terms of QALY or DALI? Any thoughts about that? That's one of the points that have been proposed. Nobuhiko?
Yes, it is a way. It is a way we can take, and if we do so, what we talk about radiation risk or radiation detriment will be more comparable to other factors. But at the same time, we need to keep consistency because radiation detriment, the basis of radiation protection, including numerical criteria and tissue weighting factors. So we need to discuss what is the best way for the future.
Yeah, but clearly that's a route which has to be investigated further. And maybe for the next step, one idea could be to express the results using both systems. So an update in the detriment and already some expression using QALY or DALI indicator. So to make a transition and to provide elements for comparing and assessing what is the impact of the evolution. So I think we are very close now, but I don't know which one to. So sorry for all the questions, detriment and QALY. So one question is about uncertainty. I think that the expression of uncertainty related detriment calculation is important for easily understanding and detailed risk estimation. Is there any plan to express detriment values with uncertainty? Maybe some thoughts, Wei or Nobuhiko?
Not specifically.
Yeah, clearly that's one of the questions we know, and it is possible now to consider uncertainties on the different elements that are included in the detriment calculation. The question is how to propagate these sources of uncertainties. Do we have to use it? Clearly, for the application of the radiation protection system in the end, we don't need an indicator with confidence bounds, and we have to have a proposal for indicators that are simple and useful for radiation protection. But we have to find a way to quantify and to reflect and to illustrate what are the different sources of uncertainty and what is their impact in the different steps in the detriment calculation. So that's one of the works that are to be launched in the frame of this evolution of the recommendations, ICRP recommendations.
I agree. It is important to assess the magnitude and sources of the uncertainty, but at the same time, it will be important to consider how to convey the message, particularly to the society. If we do not do it carefully, it may be misleading. So such as society may think about assessment is not reliable. So conveying message regarding uncertainty is quite challenging in that sense.
Another question, maybe the last one, I think, how to treat smoking when setting baseline incidence, which is one of the characteristics of the population. The LSS risk model also takes into account the effect of smoking in its analysis. On the other hand, smokers are assumed in the radian risk estimation. I choose this one because there have been several questions that were raising the question about how to consider radiation in parallel with other risk factors, cancer risk factors like air pollution, for example, and what evolution of the detriment could we consider to take into account not only the effect of radiation but also the effect of other risk cancers like smoking or air pollution. Any thoughts? Wei, Nobuhiko?
So in other words, radiation dose response, the shape of dose response could be modified by other factors. So I think it is important to consider radiation itself is one of those risk factors for cancer induction.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point and a difficult point. Clearly, at the time being, for most of the cancer risk models that we have, we are able today to consider variation of risk with age, with attained age, with age-at exposure, with sex, but it's much more difficult to consider the impact of other risk factors or confounding factors or even genetic background and so on. There is a task group on this topic, which is a task group 111, and the draft report should be available for public consultation very soon. I think in less than 1 year. And it will provide some elements of for this question. And for the potential evolution in the detriment calculation. So I invite you to look at this draft report when it will be in public consultation. I think we have to end up now because the duration of the webinar is 2 hours. There's a lot of questions, maybe more than 10 questions that we did not consider. So what I propose is that we consider it and propose some very short answers by writing, for example, that can be provided with the slides and with the recording of the webinar. And with this to keep the time as it was scheduled. So sorry for the questions that have not been answered now, but we will consider it. And with this, I would like to thank all of you and to end up to close down this webinar. And to invite you for the next steps, so the symposium next year, and there will be also other webinars about the evolution of the revision process for the next recommendation. So all of you are invited to participate and to follow that. Nobuhiko, Wei, a last word.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. For me tonight, sorry, for you today. And yes, as Dominic said, all of you are invited to join the discussion for the future. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the questions, for the interesting discussion, and so see all of you at next occasion for the discussion of the preparation of the next ICRP recommendation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.